introduction, and now I get the honor of introducing Dr. David Kendall, who's our featured guest for the evening. Dr. Kendall and I first met in 2002 when I actually went and was interviewed by Dr. Kendall, which puts me in very good company, as the dean of our business school was also interviewed by Professor Kendall. But he's currently a professor and just stepped down from a position as the chair of the Department of Economics and Finance at the University of Virginia at Wise. He has an extensive publication history, both on scholarly publications and on publications for various institutions. He has done work for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the EPA, and the USDA, among other institutions. Prior to being at UVA Wise, he has spent time at RTI International in the Raleigh-Durham area, St. Edward's in Austin, Texas, and other institutions starting in Charleston, South Carolina. He has had a prolific career. The reason we invited Dr. Kendall here today is he recently published a book called Morality and Capitalism, a Dialogue on Freedom. And we're here to capture his thoughts this evening. The format will go, I'll ask some interview questions, we'll have a little bit of discussion back and forth, but there are note cards throughout that have been handed out, and about halfway through or so, some students in the economics club will go around and feel free to write down any question you might like me to ask Professor Kendall, and we will try to see if we can get those questions asked. Dr. Kendall, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's certainly my pleasure. I've had a wonderful day here at Selinsgrove and Susquehanna University. I've been very privileged to rejoin some friendships from as long as 20 years ago when I had the opportunity to work with people that you know well, your college president, University President Jay Lemons, and your School of Business Dean Marsha Kellair. So this is a fascinating time for me, Matt. I'm so happy to be here.
Thanks. And want to get started with the title of your book is Morality and Capitalism, and what prompted you, what made you think, I want to write a book called Morality and Capitalism?
That's a very good question that I'm going to preface with a little story before I tell you a bit more about it. I actually taught twice now at my home college in Virginia a course that I titled Morality and Capitalism. And I was fortunate to be invited to teach that to an honors class and was invited to offer a course to the honors students. And when I told the director of the honors program what I was going to teach for that course, I told him, I'm going to teach a course called The Morality of Capitalism. His left eyebrow went up, and he said, did you mean the immorality of capitalism? And I said, no, John, I meant just what I said. So that's a little backstory. I've been teaching economics and finance for I guess 30 plus years. That's why I've been to a lot of different places. They kicked me out. But I got to experience a lot of teaching, and I will say that one of my personal heroes in the economics profession, I don't mind telling anybody that I personally think that he was the brightest and best economist of the 20th century. And that, for me, is Milton Friedman. Some of you know who Milton Friedman is. I know my good friend Matt does. I have very, very high regard for Milton Friedman, perhaps more than many of my fellow economists do. But Milton Friedman was a completely unabashed defender of capitalism, to be sure. In fact, Milton Friedman, aside from perhaps Ayn Rand, is the person that I think of most who was a very impressive, very intelligent, very thoughtful, advocate for capitalism. And so I was heavily influenced by reading the works of Milton Friedman, both as an undergraduate and in graduate school. As an undergraduate, I read Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. Some of you no doubt read that book. If you haven't, I highly commend it to your attention. And then in graduate school, I read his book that I believe Matt is probably assigned to his students to read, called Capitalism, Capitalism and Freedom. Or is it Freedom and Capitalism? I can't get that backwards, but it doesn't matter really. It's an excellent book as well. Well, somewhere about, I'm going to say, around the year 2000, back when, primarily when I was at the same time Matt and I first got to know each other at RTI in North Carolina, University of Tranquil Park, I somehow became very interested in listening to a lot of audiobooks while I would walk around the RTI campus, because I was a commuter. I actually lived in Virginia, but commuted back and forth to RTI, which is 3.5 hours away, and so I'd stay there and go back and forth for a while. Did a lot of walking and listening to audiobooks, and one set of books that I started listening to is the writings of Professor Peter Kraft, who is a really pretty well-known philosopher, who is a professor emeritus now. He spends a lot of time all around the country these days talking to people about all the work that he's done, right? He does. And he's the one who first got me interested in morality. Now, when people think about economists, they're probably not the first thing they think of is, here's a guy that's going to be interested in morality. You probably think you're going to be interested in money, I would guess. But I got interested in thinking about morality. And as I've been teaching over the past 30 years, it became clear to me in some of the classes that I taught, we would talk about business ethics. And I would ask the students, what in the world does it mean to be ethical? Well, Peter Kraft believes, as I now do, that it doesn't mean anything different than being moral. Those are synonyms for him, and I adopted that perspective myself. That I don't make any distinction between those two things. And so when we teach classes in business schools about business ethics, you might as well call it business morals for my purposes. There's no difference between the two words in my lexicon, at least. So I found that students did not know. I would ask them, what is ethical behavior? Can you tell me? And they couldn't. I don't think it means they didn't have any ideas. I think they had plenty of ideas. I just don't think they had ever been challenged to think carefully about it and articulate what it could possibly mean to be moral. And then the other thing that really struck me, and has struck me over the second 15 years or so of my career, is how utterly negative so many people are about the word capitalism. I don't know how many letters does it have in it. I don't know, but a lot of people think it's a 4-letter word. And I could not quite understand, how is that possible? Here we live in the United States, which is, I think, the most prosperous and successful country ever on planet Earth. You may disagree with me, I know my daughter sometimes does. But I think the history of capitalism, at least what we think is capitalism, is abundantly clear that this political system, this political social system that we call capitalism, should not be damned, it should be praised. And so I began to think about, well, why is it that people dislike capitalism? And they do. Even some of our friends and neighbors have bad things to say about it, particularly in the academy. In academia, it's not hard to find folks who will tell you that capitalism is pretty much a bad thing. And so I began to think about that, and it slowly dawned on me over, I don't know, a period of the last 15 years or so, that people have now come to acknowledge pretty widely, really, that capitalism works. It does work. That's not argued much. It used to be argued quite a bit. It's no longer much argument. So if you think about it, okay, here we've got a system that works. And what do I mean by it? Well, works, I mean that it produces the best prosperity for humans that we know how to get. So why is it so disliked? And in my book, and I mentioned this to Matt's class this morning, if you take the time to Google, everybody knows how to Google things, right? And just type in the search bar, capitalism images. Go try that when you go home later this evening or tomorrow sometime and see what you see. I'll tell you what you'll see. Thousands and thousands of pictures that depict capitalism as evil, gluttonous, greedy, just a bad thing. Well, I was trying to reconcile all this in my mind, and it finally dawned on me that even though capitalism produces prosperity for people, there are a lot of people who simply think it's immoral. And we don't want to be immoral people, do we?
If I can pause right there. So when you talk about morality, and we talked about, you mentioned earlier, business ethics, and students might have difficulty describing ethics. I know you go into a lot of detail in your book to come up with your definition of what morality means, and you also have what's called the moral imperative.
That's right.
Before we go on to, is capitalism moral, what is morality, or what is the moral imperative?
I'm so glad you asked. The first half of my book it's in two parts. The first part is called morality, and I do that very thing because I did want to do a careful exploration of what could the idea possibly mean. What is it to be moral? And of course, we know that moral philosophy is a topic that literally hundreds and thousands of people have written about. There's a huge literature about it. And I tried to tackle some of that and understand what are the leading ideas. And I came to a proposition that I decided to call the moral imperative. The moral imperative. And it's very simple. As soon as I say it to you, if you've not read anything in the book, you'll remember it the rest of your life. It's very easy to understand. It's clear. And I think that it absolutely captures everything there is to capture. Maybe I'm a little arrogant about that. About the word morality. And it is just this. Here's the moral imperative. Do not compel another unjustly. Do not compel another person unjustly. You say, what the hell does that have to do with morality? Well, here's what it has to do with morality. If you steal something, you're compelling that person to give you his stuff. What about if you kill someone, if you murder someone? Well, you're certainly compelling them to give you perhaps their most valuable possession of all, their own life. What if you defraud someone, you lie to them, to cheat them? You're compelling them. Now, Ayn Rand, who many of you have heard about and maybe read one of her novels, or maybe two of them. A lot of people have read Atlas Shrugged. She taught us through her novels and her philosophy what's often been called the non-aggression principle, just simply the idea that you shouldn't aggress against others. Whoever is the initiator of aggression is wrong. That's immoral behavior. Well, I just took that one step further based on just a little thinking about it and reading a lot of other moral philosophers, and came up with the notion that here is an imperative. It's a command. Imperatives are command. It's like run, stop, sit. That moral imperative, I decided, made sense to me at least. Do not compel another unjustly. So that's the moral imperative. That's right. My claim is that we can use that as a guideline to tell us whether or not we're behaving morally. That's my claim. And so I wanted to lay that case out in part one of the book, of why that seemed to make sense to me. And then, of course, my ultimate objective with the whole book was to make two propositions and support those, Matt. And the first proposition was, capitalism is moral. And the second proposition is, and oh, by the way, it's the only system of political economy that is.
So, I think there would be a number of people in here who came in with the impression, as you said, who might have asked, didn't you mean the immorality of capitalism?
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Why is capitalism, we'll start with the first part. Why is capitalism moral?
Okay. Simply because, maybe I should actually jump ahead and tell you what the defining features of capitalism is, because there's more to say about it, but we need that piece to answer that question, I think. Capitalism, real capitalism, has 4 tenets, 4 propositions, 4 ideas. They're big ideas, they're important ideas. And if you live in a political economy that possesses these 4 characteristics, then you live in a system of capitalism. And if you don't have all of them, you do not. So here's what they are. The first is private property. Private property. It hasn't always been the case that individuals were allowed to own private property. It's actually a more recent phenomenon than most people know. It really is. It's private property. The second, and what I take to actually be really the heart and soul of capitalism, it's only second because you have to have private property to do it, is called voluntary exchange. Now when I use the word exchange, you probably thought about buying a cheeseburger or something, right? And that's not wrong.
Buying your book.
Buying a book. And that is exchange. But it's also true that almost all human interactions are exchange. We are exchanging things with each other all the time. It's not just commercial, in other words. And the key word is voluntary. Voluntary exchange. You and someone else voluntarily agreed to exchange. So that's the second tenet of the political system called capitalism. The third tenet is freedom. Personal freedom. You are free or you're not free. And if you're not free, if you live in a political economy where you don't have freedom, you certainly cannot call that capitalism. And the fourth principle, the fourth tenet of a capitalistic system is just law. Just law. So those 4 things, repeat them real quickly here: private property, voluntary exchange, personal freedom, and just law. Okay, so Matt asked, well, how can you make the argument that capitalism is moral? Well, first, you make the argument of what morality is. And if you go along with the idea that you can capture the idea of morality with the moral imperative, do not compel another person unjustly, guess what? In true capitalism, you don't. People cannot, are not compelled. Everything is done by voluntary exchange. And so it's really quite simple argument.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here. So, in a capitalist society, sounds like there would be no government provision for helping somebody who's hungry. So, is this moral if somebody is, say, hungry? Somebody's starving. Isn't it moral to perhaps compel somebody with more money to provide food for the person who's hungry?
No. Quick answer. Here's why. Immoral means do not justify virtuous ends. If you compel someone, actually, your compulsion of that person is part of the ends. You cannot just ignore that. Let's suppose I come up to Naomi and I pull a gun on Naomi and I say, give me all the money in your purse. Now, I'm definitely compelling Naomi. Is it okay if I'm doing that to go buy food for Joe? No, because I have compelled Naomi. That is part of the end, and that is immoral. It's interesting. I've asked a lot of people over the past 2 years, whether or not they agreed that the moral imperative was a good way to make a statement of what is right human behavior. Guess how many people have said, no, that's not a good statement. No, it's just fine to compel people unjustly. Guess how many people have said that? Zero. As you're sitting there right now, I imagine that you would agree that the moral imperative is a good imperative. It says, do not compel another person unjustly. So I make a distinction.
I was just going to hit on this, the virtue versus...
Yes, it's an important distinction. Morality and virtue aren't the same thing, even though if we go to a dictionary and look up morality, it's probably the case that they're going to include the word virtue or good, something like that, in the definition. But there's a reason that we have two different words for those ideas, because they're not the same. The way I put it in the book, which I think is a reasonable way to put it, is that if you wish to be a virtuous person, which just means that you behave in ways that other people take to be good ways, have a concrete...
You might feed somebody who is hungry.
Sure, just exactly what Matt said. What about somebody who's hungry and you give them food? Most of us, me included, would argue that that's a very virtuous act. Now let's turn it around. What if you did not give them food? Well, what I would be inclined to say is that was not virtuous, but it was also not immoral. Why not? Because you did not compel them, did not force them, did not coerce them. We all might agree that you didn't do anything good for them, in which case I would say, well, you're not very virtuous, and that's fine. But you were immoral if you did not compel someone. So I make that distinction. I think it's a useful distinction to talk about moral behavior as opposed to virtuous behavior. And of course, we know that ancient philosophers did make distinctions and did talk a lot about virtue and virtuous behavior and the qualities that could bring us as humans. But I particularly wanted to make a very clear statement about what's immoral behavior, because it affects us also very much in the political economy in which we live.
So capitalism is moral because you're not forcing anybody unjustly. Does that mean, to follow up, does that mean, is capitalism virtuous?
Is capitalism virtuous?
Less virtuous than...
I believe that it's self-evident. All you have to do is read a little history, look around the world a while. You don't even have to be paying close attention. And what you see is that in any society, the closer approach they make to having private property, voluntary exchange, personal freedom, and just law, what do you see in those social systems? You see human prosperity. Does that mean that we eliminate poverty? Does that mean there are no poor in those countries? No. It doesn't mean that, because that's a pretty tall order. What it does mean is that people are more prosperous than any other system that we've ever been able to even entertain.
So a lot of individuals protest against capitalism, and I know that you don't like the term, but because people use it, I'm going to bring it up, and you can give your comments, but talk about crony capitalism, or there's the Occupy groups that discuss how favors are bought in Washington. Aren't these faults with capitalism in society?
It's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I actually tried to come to an understanding of why is it that capitalism is so denigrated by lots of people who are friends and neighbors even, and certainly around the world. It has a bad name. And I finally came to the conclusion that it is because they do not know what capitalism really is, and they are mistaking what they take to be capitalism for something that I finally decided I would call democratic cronyism. It's democratic because we get to vote, but it's cronyism because it is cronyism. It is self-serving. It is taking advantage of people. Most people, if you ask them, well, what's the most capitalist country in the world? They say, well, of course, it's America, isn't it? But if you ask me that, I would say, no, We may make a closer approach to the pole of pure capitalism on the one hand versus the other pole of the continuum, which I call tyranny on the other hand. America may make a closer approach to the pole of capitalism, but think about it. Do we have private property? To a degree. And then there's all that land out in the West that's owned by whom? The federal government. Say what? You must be kidding. Yes. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of acres of land in the United States is not owned by private individuals. It's owned by an entity that we all sort of imagine as an amorphous blob or something floating out there called government. Well, so we don't even have that down yet. Okay? How about voluntary exchange? Is all the exchange that you engage in voluntary? No, it certainly isn't. In fact, you're compelled. As we sit here right now, you are being compelled to buy health insurance. Are you not? Well, that's the law. Is there anybody in here who didn't want to buy any? I don't know if there is or not, but you will be buying some, or you'll be breaking the law. And then you can go the other way, too. In some instances, we're compelled to enter into an exchange that we didn't really want to. In other cases, even in the United States, we are prohibited from engaging in an exchange that we would like to engage in. I went and got a haircut a couple of weeks ago, and you probably all know that you can't cut somebody's hair commercially unless you get a license, don't you? Did you know that? You probably knew that. You have to get a license. And to get that license, what do you have to do, man?
Hundreds of hours.
Hundreds of hours of study. Not entirely sure what you study, but they study something, and then they are allowed to get a license. Well, for about 3-4 years, I was a registered investment advisor. You know, it took all the time to learn all this stuff and pass all the tests and become a registered investment advisor. Well, it turns out that the reason I did that is because you can't give somebody financial advice on their investments unless you are allowed to. So we don't have entirely voluntary exchange. We have a larger nature of it than lots of places on the planet, to be sure. But we certainly don't have it completely. How about freedom? Are we free? Well,
we sing land of the free.
We're the land of the free and the home of the brave. But we're not quite as free as you might think. And do we have just law? Oh my goodness. We could have a symposium on this alone, couldn't we? To what extent do we have just law, even in America? And I'm here to tell you that I'm just as happy to be in America as anybody in this room. Absolutely, there isn't a single other place I'd rather live. So don't hear me saying that America is a bad place. It's not. I'm simply saying it's not capitalism. What is it? It's democratic cronyism. In the book, I spend several pages describing what democratic cronyism is. So we don't have time to repeat all that here, but you know about some of it. We experienced some of it in 2008 when the major financial institutions were bailed out. Did we not? The big banks were not allowed to fail. Most of you may or may not know, I don't know whether you do or not, that most banks were not in trouble. There were just 2 or 3 really big ones who were and got bailed out. What is that? That's cronyism. That's what it's cronyism. There's more incidents of it than I could possibly, and we could make a long list, but it wouldn't be worth the time.
Sure.
So I call it democratic cronyism, and what I came to think is that most people who are damning capitalism are mistaking democratic cronyism for capitalism, and that they don't really quite know what capitalism is and what it isn't.
Sure. So you made the case two strong 2 points. One, capitalism is moral.
Yes.
And the second point is, I'm sure I'm not quite stating it exactly, capitalism is the only moral system.
All other systems of political economy are not moral. And why are they not?
So why would a socialist country, communist country, why is that not moral?
Because you will be compelled. There is no country, there's no political economy that's ever existed that was called socialism that did not compel people to do what a small set of people said they were going to be doing. It's an ideal that somehow you could have that. But if you did have an ideal situation that people were not compelling you, there was no kind of centralized compulsion that you have to do this, you can't do that, guess what it would be? It would be capitalism, it wouldn't be socialism. So you can tick off various forms of political economy that you know anything about, all the way from outright dictatorship to a king, to socialism, to democratic socialism, communism, whatever the differences might be between communism and socialism. That's a whole set of ideas in itself. Each and every one of them does what? Each and every one of them has somebody compelling you. Do they not? That's what makes them not moral.
So again, I want to play devil's advocate. And certainly for the questions, if you're thinking of questions, feel free to write them down, and in a few minutes we'll have some of our economics club members come grab them. But thinking about Apple. So if I want an iPhone, there's only one place I can go to get that. That's through Apple. Am I being compelled to do business with Apple in this case? Is that being compelled?
I see no force. I see no compulsion. I see no coercion. I see only voluntary exchange if you decide to buy an Apple computer or an iPad or an iPod. And that's the beauty of it. It's entirely voluntary. One of the things that I didn't make all this stuff up, by the way. I don't take myself to have invented hardly anything, if anything at all, to say in this little book of mine. It's just said in a particular way. When you engage in voluntary exchange with another person, both parties to the exchange have reason to say thank you. Because both parties to any voluntary exchange got more than they gave up in value. Think about it. Have you ever made a purchase? You used money, you went down and bought something, you made a purchase. Did you not get more than the value of the money that you gave up? Assuming you didn't make a mistake. People do make mistakes. We've all had the occasion of buyer's regret that we thought we wanted something, and as soon as we got home we found out we didn't. But that's not what I'm talking about. If you don't have the buyer's regret, if you go purchase something with your dollars and it's a voluntary exchange, you're getting more in value than you gave up. And that's the characteristic of all voluntary exchange.
Again, devil's advocate question here. So if capitalism do not unjustly compel, and I know that you put this in the book, the book, for those who haven't read it, has a very nice, what I found very interesting way to present things, where you had a mentor and a mentee who were discussing ideas back and forth. But one idea I know that the person who's being mentored mentions, well, what about the poor, right? If we're not unjustly compelling, shouldn't we take care of the poor?
Oh, absolutely. Any virtuous person would. And you know what? If you look around, you will find that people who behave morally also have a tendency to behave virtuously. And that's what I see. I don't see a lot of people compelling other people who are also high on the virtue index. I see it just the opposite. People who behave morally tend to behave virtuously. And people who live in a prosperous society like we do in the United States tend very definitely to be philanthropic and take care of those who are least advantaged, who are members of our society. More so than you don't get the kind of concern and care for the disadvantaged in any other kind of political system other than a closer approach to capitalism. It's interesting to note, if you do a little history of reading and study the early days of the United States, when government was not a powerful, federal government particularly was not a powerful and prevailing force in our lives. There were many, many philanthropic organizations that formed, and many of them were called churches, by the way, that had other parts of their mission as well. But there were other non-church organizations that formed for people to do just that, to help each other and to help people that were disadvantaged. So it isn't the case that if you don't have a federal government compelling you to give your dollars earned to them so that they can give them to somebody else, it isn't the case that people have no concern for that. In fact, it's just the opposite. The more prosperous a country is economically, the more likely it is that they're going to have a lot of virtuous activity going on to take care of people who are unable to care for themselves.
Super, super. So I will ask one more question. I'll ask if, I think Courtney and Andrew agreed, two of our students in the economics club, if you could just go down the aisles and see if anybody has any note cards they would like to turn in with questions. So my final question, what would be, so what's your recommendation for, you said that the United States is democratic cronyism?
That's what I call it.
What's your recommendations? How do we make the United States better from your point of view?
In the final chapter of my book, as I was writing it, I changed my mind over the period of time that I was writing about how long the book should be and what I should include and what not. And finally, I decided that it would be better to make it shorter than longer and make it as readable as possible, to try to reach as many people with the ideas as possible. And I finally decided, well, you know what, I'm going to write this last chapter. And I do have some optimism about our ability as people to make a closer approach to true capitalism. And so I thought about, well, how could we do that? What could we possibly do to make our lives even better? We've got good lives here in this country already. We could be even better. And these needed to be very practical things. And so I wanted to distill it down to what I personally believe would be very, very powerful changes that we could do if we wanted to. The first is this. It's really, really simple. Don't vote for an incumbent. When? Never. What do you mean? Don't re-elect someone? That's exactly what I mean. Well, should I vote Democrat or Republican? I really don't care. That's up to you. Just don't vote for the incumbent. Now, how would that possibly help us? It would break the chain of cronyism. That's how. How much money are the people on K Street in D.C., which is ground zero for cronyism in the United States, where all the lobbyists have offices, how much money are they going to spend trying to influence a congressman they know is not going to be there next year? Not much. I call it the New Blood Party. Can I get you to join the New Blood Party? Won't ask you for money. We're not going to elect officers. We're not going to hold a convention. We're not going to put up candidates. If you want to become a member of the New Blood Party, all you have to do is don't vote for an incumbent. Vote for whoever you want to, so long as they're not an incumbent. Now, I know a lot of politicians won't like that, but the idea of career politicians empowers cronyism. The incidence of it makes it possible to have cronyism. The second proposition that I want to offer is pretty radical in a lot of people's point of view. And it would take more than us just not voting for incumbents. And that is, we might have to have a constitutional amendment for this one. Let's not pass any laws unless they can be passed with a 4/5 majority. 80% majority, not simple majority. Why? You will not, I don't think, be able to get very many unjust laws passed with an 80% majority. Look what's happened in our own Senate the past 6, 7 years, whatever it's been. They cannot get 60 people to vote for most things. How many laws has the Senate been able to pass? Most of those laws, if they did pass them, would have not been particularly just laws. It's very difficult to get 80% of an electoral body to come to an agreement. Does that mean we wouldn't have laws? No, we just wouldn't have unjust laws. We would have only the laws that are just, that we truly do want to help us through life. But that's the two propositions that I came up with. I think that if you can imagine such a system, think how different it could possibly be. I think it would be very powerful stuff.
Well, I think they're sorting out which cards I get, and then I get to ask another question.
It's just sorting.
Presidential candidates. Do you have a thought on most moral versus least moral on either side?
Well, you know, I don't think people are more immoral. I think their behaviors could be immoral, and sometimes are. Interestingly enough, I'm actually pretty optimistic about people. I really think that most people, most of the time, do behave morally. They really do. Most of us do. When's the last time you went around and compelled someone? There's just a small number of people who are willing to do that, actually. So it's a behavior that we could classify as moral or immoral, not the person. People are just people. Their behavior is either reprehensible or commendable. Of the candidates that are running, the only one that I'm aware of that has a great aversion to compelling people to do things that, just like me, is Rand Paul, frankly. I doubt seriously if he can get elected. He has the right ideas about the power of capitalism and power of not aggressing against people.
There are a few questions for us?
All right.
Oh wow, that's a lot. So I'll apologize in advance that we are not getting through there, but I think you don't want to be here until midnight. So. But I'll just pick out a couple and we'll go through. First question, I think this is a great question. Do you think getting rid of eminent domain will help the U.S. lean towards capitalism?
Yeah, I actually have a real problem with eminent domain. What is eminent domain? That's a small set of people telling you we're now taking your property. That's an immoral act. It's done in the name of supposedly a virtuous outcome. But I would argue that compelling someone is part of the outcome. It's not separable. That is part of the outcome, and it's immoral. You cannot be virtuous if you are not first moral. Morality is a necessary condition for virtue. That's the way I look at it, at least.
Right.
So I don't like eminent domain at all.
These are great questions here. What is just compulsion? An example or two, please.
Okay, great.
Please.
That's wonderful. At chapter 4, if I remember correctly, the book spends a fair amount of time doing just this, taking us through some various examples. And while I was writing the book, I never tired of asking people to see if they could come up with some examples of compulsion that was just or unjust. Because people do have a problem, as they should, with the word just. If you read the book, you'll find out that I argue that the word just means right reason. If you are reasoning rightly, then it's justly. And we give some examples. Here's an example of one of my students, believe it or not. Students are very creative people. And in the first time through, when I taught the course that I called Morality and Capitalism, lo and behold, we come in one day, and this very question comes up, and this guy says, well, what about Forrest Gump, for goodness sakes? He grabbed up Lieutenant Dan against his will and carried him off to safety. He compelled Lieutenant Dan, did he not? I said, you're damn right he did. He compelled him, but it was not unjust. And indeed, Lieutenant Dan thanked him profusely later on when he regained his rationality. Did he not? He did. We compel our children all the time, do we not? Why are we doing that? For their benefit. That is not unjust compulsion. When I keep my, I gave this example, I keep my dog inside a fence. I have two of them actually, and when I walk that dog on a leash, I'm compelling the dog. Is that just or unjust compulsion? Well, we all know it's just compulsion. And what does it go to? It goes to intent. What is the intent of the compulsion? You cannot behave immorally unless you have ill intent. If God help me, I don't want to do this, but if I back up, leaving the parking lot this evening and run over somebody, would that be an immoral act? It wouldn't be immoral, it would be perhaps negligent, but I had no intent to do that. Did not mean anybody ill will, so that doesn't classify as an immoral act. So anytime we have an act that is unjust compulsion, it's motivated by ill will, just as Kant said, really. And its intention, its very intention, is to compel for the advantage of the compelled.
Yeah, these are two very similar questions. I'll ask them both back to back. One of them says the top 1% of households received 8.9% of all pre-tax income in '76, but in 2012 it was 22.46%. With growing income inequality, how is capitalism moral? The other one is very similar. How is the United States the most prosperous nation when the disparity between the rich and the impoverished is so large?
Okay, so it's the income inequality question. A couple of things, more than a couple of things can be said about that. Obviously, we could spend a lot of time talking about that. In fact, recently, Piketty has written a book about the thing.
700 pages?
It's a big book.
Some of my students are looking forward to reading.
A lot of economic discussion, economists criticizing or praising the whole thing. So what about that? Here we are in a country, United States, where we have some people who are just insanely rich. I mean, they have money. We've got some people who don't have that kind of money. Is that a bad thing per se? Well, it may or may not be a bad thing or a good thing. That's going to get us into the realm of, yes, again, virtue and values, whether it's good or bad. But as long as people who are earning all this massive, enormous income are not compelling somebody, they're earning it through voluntary exchange, for goodness sakes. We're giving them their money. Who's the richest person that you know in the United States? Bill Gates, maybe? My goodness, Bill Gates has done more for us. Of course we'll voluntarily give him our money. These are some wonderful, wonderful things. How many of us have one of those devices? I've got one in my pocket. For goodness sakes, we did it voluntarily. And so now we're going to complain because Bill is rich? I don't think that we have grounds to do that. That's one thing that he said. He didn't compel anybody to get rich. He, in fact, voluntarily exchanged some things that he could do in return for our money. Of course, we could have spent our money any way we wanted to. We chose to buy those products, that software. The other thing that I want to say about that is that just 250 years ago, do you know what the median income, now I'm going to give you these numbers in inflation-adjusted dollars, so don't bother yourself with inflation. It has nothing to do with inflation. 250 years ago, what do you think median income was in the richest place on the planet, wherever that was? The answer is about $400 a year. What? That's imagine if you, living here today in current society, got income of just $400. That's it. $400 a year. That's pretty poor, isn't it? Now, in the last 250 years, in the Western countries, and particularly in the United States, what's median income today, man? I can't remember these things.
The U.S. is just under, I think it's just under 50,000.
Yeah, it's
In the ballpark.
it's ballpark somewhere between $50,000 a year in 250 years. The point I'm wanting to make here is that even though there is a great disparity between the incomes of the so-called 1%ers and the incomes of the bottom quartile of the income distribution, it's also the case that people in the bottom quartile of the income distribution in the United States live better than kings lived 250 years ago. That's a fascinating, true statement. Here's another one that I put in the book. In 1913, the quality of health care, let's just call it 1900, the particular quote comes, it was 1913 for some reason. The level of health care available in the United States was worse just 100 years ago than it is in third world countries today. Poor as they are, they have better health care than an American had 100 years ago. That's fascinating to me. So people who are all bound up and focused on income inequality seem to me to be bound up and focused on the wrong thing. I think they should be focused on human prosperity instead. It almost smacks a little bit of jealousy, doesn't it? The notion that if someone is very, very rich and someone is not nearly as rich, there's something wrong with that picture. Well, maybe there is, but maybe there isn't too. Even John Rawls, who some of you know, John Rawls was a Harvard.
The Veil of Ignorance.
Yeah, John Rawls wrote a book called A Theory of Justice, some of you know. But even John Rawls, who, if he were still alive and here on the stage today, not only would it be a wonderful thing, but we'd be having a wonderful debate. Even John Rawls thought that you had to have, and could have, income inequality so long as you took care of those at the bottom. And John Rawls was anything but a supporter of capitalism. So I would say that we should be more interested in whether or not we are making a closer approach to capitalism and whether that's leading to greater prosperity all across. Another final point that I'll make on that is the 1%ers aren't the same people from one year to the next, and neither is the bottom quartile of the income distribution. I was in the lowest quartile 30 years ago. I'm not now.
I suspect some people in this room are in the lowest.
Absolutely.
Right now.
And then when you get to be 20 years older, you're going to be in a different quartile. You're going to be up, you're going to make progress, move up. So we have this notion that we've got these fixed sets of people. Here's the 1%ers out there, they're richer than God, and here's the poor people, and they're the same people year after year after year. Nothing could be further from the truth.
I think we only have time for a couple more questions, and I know you would not have this any other way. I tried to find what I thought would be the toughest questions to ask, because I'm pretty sure you'd say, give me the toughest ones you have.
That's fine.
At what point is environmental destruction by unregulated business considered compelling unjustly?
Well, it's certainly the case that if we need to be careful here when we start talking about business as if there's some entity called business and it's a real thing. We tend to talk to each other in these collective nouns, don't we? There really isn't a government. There are 546 people that have faces and names that I call the federal government. They're real people and make real decisions. Business doesn't do anything. Some individuals do. If there is actually a person out there that is degrading our environment, the atmosphere, let's say, that we have to breathe, and they're doing it intently with purpose to harm us, and they know that they're doing that, then guess what I would call that? Immoral. I would call that immoral behavior. If they're compelling us to damage our health, and they know they're doing it, and they're doing it on purpose, then that's immoral. I don't have an issue with that. Then what do? The whole issue of environmental degradation and damage and what we can do about that is a very thorny issue that lots of economists spent lots of time, not just economists, but other people too, thinking about, because it is the problem of the commons, which is a very well-known problem that Garrett Hardin wrote about a long, long time ago. And everyone's pretty much agreed that we will have to have just law. We will have to have, particularly when we come to the issue of using the commons, the air, the atmosphere, what we typically just call the environment these days in many instances, we're going to have some way of using those resources in a way that doesn't compel people with what economists call externalities. There's no avoiding that. So how are we going to do that? We're going to use a system of political economy. We're going to use, as much as we can, voluntary exchange. And when we can't, we're going to have to rely on our political institutions. But what I'd like to see coming out of our political institutions is just law, not cronyism, which too often we get.
All right, great. And the final question I will ask. You said that you always get more than you give for voluntary exchange of dollars. That you want to say thank you. This person puts 3 examples that I think they disagree. Mentioning, I don't want to say thanks from a fine, maybe parking ticket. It doesn't say parking ticket, but just knowing on a college campus, I'm guessing that might be what I'm thinking about here. College tuition is more expensive than it should be, and for healthcare, you pay for more than you get.
Oh my. Okay, let's examine those. A fine is compulsion, just right out of the box. You're being compelled to pay it, or not. That's not voluntary exchange, so we put that aside. That's not voluntary exchange. What was the next one?
The next one was college tuition.
College tuition is more expensive than it should be. Is somebody forcing you to come? Or are you voluntarily coming and paying for college education? If somebody's compelling you to go, then you've got a case. That would be immoral behavior. It's not voluntary exchange. But if you voluntarily decide, I'm going to part company with these, my dollars, in exchange for that, an education, that's voluntary exchange. And why in the world would you be doing that if you didn't believe you were getting greater value than you were sacrificing? Why would you be doing it? I have to conclude that that's not an exception to the observation that parties to a voluntary exchange have reason to say thank you, both parties. Now the medical care thing, oh my goodness, don't even get us started. We have anything but voluntary exchange in healthcare. And it's getting worse, not better. Healthcare market, well, there really isn't one. There isn't a market. It is a complete system that goes against practically every principle of voluntary exchange there is. Most of you, the last time you went and saw a medical health care giver, who paid for it? For most of you. Did you drag some money out of your pocket? You might have, but if you did, it was probably a copay. It was probably like $10 or $20, right? What did the doctor get paid, or the nurse practitioner get paid, or the clinic get paid?
A lot more than that.
A whole lot more. Who paid that? We have anything but voluntary exchange going on in healthcare right now. And unfortunately, the ACA hasn't done anything except make it worse, frankly. But that's a whole different story, isn't it?
So we don't have much time. Any concluding words of wisdom for Susquehanna University students and our guests this evening?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you also for being so patient for listening to an old guy ramble on. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I know about you. Had some great conversations with Matt's students today, which were just absolutely fascinating for me, so thank you for that. So I don't know if I have any pearls of wisdom for you, but I will say this. I invite you to join the New Blood Party.
On that, I think if you could join me in thanking Dr. David.